All right, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining. This is the final recorded session on the first half of Cohort 4. It's August 22nd, 2023, and we are going to discuss Chapter 5. So before we look at what we might have ahead of us from questions or anything else, does anyone want to make any general comments on 5? I'm just anyone can give a thought. Just since we're on Chapter 5 in the neurobiology, we talked, I think, a little bit in the Chapter 10 closing discussion for Cohort 3 about some of the topics like what does empirical evidence or what does any experimental setting have to do with free energy principle active inference, and we reflect a little bit on this recent paper that with Isomura et al. That broke through kind of another level, not necessarily even from a epistemic perspective. Oh, I guess in terms of people's awareness, it was epistemic in that sense. But then I was thinking about this was in 2018. I mean, it's the same title. I know that the work has proceeded a lot since then, so that's not to say that they rehash the same. But in some ways, because there is a difference between map and territory, between models of X and X, in a way, there's this eternal gap that just continues to swallow up experimental results, much to the chagrin of people who think that just one more experiment is gonna bridge or map the gap. And that's kind of like what some of us are told as graduate students. A lot of graduate school has to do with creating a data set, and people get into the zone of thinking that that one data set is going to be addressing a question, even a narrow one. And of course, if it's not helpful, then let's not waste our resources to do that. But at the same time, people were saying that the relationship between gene expression and behavior was resolved in the 90s. And it's the same language that comes out today. And then even in this kind of fractal free energy way, it's what were we looking for in the Petri dish again? Ollie?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say, because in fact, I would love to see in newer editions of the textbook to see some of the new directions in what some people call radical biology to be incorporated much more than we see currently in the textbook, because actually the works of scientists such as Michael Levin, and even before that, I mean, Varela, Montana, and Capra, they show some radically new approaches to see biology and even life itself through the conceptions of autopoiesis and allopoiesis and other related terms. But I believe that closer incorporation of these concepts into the textbook can help to see the bigger picture, which connects Bayesian mechanics as an overarching theory of every quote-unquote thing to active inference. Because the way it stands now, and in particular the way Chapter 5 stands now, there seems quite a big gap between what Bayesian mechanics represents as a theory of everything and its neurobiological representation, or I don't know, neurobiological evidence or whatever. But if there was, I mean, more material on these new directions of radical biology, I believe these gaps can begin to be filled, and the bigger picture can finally emerge as a kind of continuous picture without any significant and possibly confusing gaps in between.
Anyone else want to give a thought on that? Just one speculation here. The map territory theory practice, the sort of dualistic dialectic is well known. Questions like, what does math have to do with biology, and what does statistics have to do with something like a system of interest? So that's kind of the classic. We're dealing with another theoretical distinction. Within the domain of theory, we're making a distinction, not a homogenization, but a distinction between the more theoretical physics axiomatic view and the lens or tradition or method or approach or process theory described by active inference. That level of disentanglement of kind of like the Platonic core from the more manifest models in theory, but theory in practice. And that's like exactly where ActInf sits. So I think in the live chat for the symposium session, Duvid and I were kind of going back and forth. And his contention was like, well, active inference has been like really useful in the machine learning and artificial intelligence space, but it hasn't made any contributions to neuroscience. And then, I mean, there's so many angles to take on that point, but like one is that it hasn't made many contributions relative to what you think another theory has done, or is it hasn't made enough contributions relative to what your preferences for what it could have done by this time are? That's one angle. But then the other angle that kind of presented itself was like are we looking for experimental validation of the free energy principle, or are we looking for people who want to apply active inference, and that's the experimental validation? I mean, what if it was experimental validation of sum of squares linear regression on electronic healthcare record data? Be like, talk about a non sequitur. Decade after decade, experimental validation of linear regression on rainfall and tree growth data. How many decades before you just say we used a linear regression? And if you think we could have used it better, then tell us how. Or if you have another model other than a regression, let's see it. But that mobilizes the discussion in like a very radical way. Ali?
Yes, and I also don't think that active inference or FEP can be considered as kind of niche theoretical thinking anymore, because recently I'm more and more often I come across some articles or books that don't mention active inference or FEP at all, or I don't know, any work related to active inference. But the ideas presented in these works are very, very similar to what active inference's assertions. So it looks like there's the box, and active inference or FEP fits right into. It's a theory that is proposed. At the right time and for the right audience, I believe, because if it were proposed, it was proposed about, I don't know, 3 decades ago, maybe or probably it could go into oblivion without people being aware of any of its significance at all. But as I said, it seems like the present time is kind of fertile for these kinds of not radical, but a bit out of the box thinking that can potentially help to reshape our understanding of life in its broader sense. So yeah, again, its current status seems to me like it's beginning to be mainstream, or at least in the early phases of mainstream theory is truly evident from some recent work in this area.
Yeah. And it's so fun to see the memes and the narrative sharpen. Like when I was just walking around a few minutes ago, I was thinking, okay, reward maximization or precision optimization on getting more reward, same thing. But also surprise bounding is more general than reward. But you could make a pure reward model. We see that in the textbook. So it's like, what's your first principle? Reward, surprise bounding, or something else? Or nothing, or you haven't thought about it. It's all fine. But which one of them is it? Or do you want to pop out a level and even have like a different way of approaching the question? So it's not like presenting a closed box. It's like a more dynamical frame, which is largely, potentially even overwhelmingly congruent with simply modern statistical physics. And again, then do you want to say, well, I have an alternate statistical physics branch, or I have higher visions for what statistical physics could do than what it is doing? It's like, congratulations, then you're a researcher. Now, it still may be decades or never till you make a contribution, but that's exactly the path of a researcher, seeing an area and then thinking that it can go beyond. And like, well, I don't have that alternative proposal for niche construction yet, but I want to be in the game to be there to recognize when it does happen, or I want to make something happen eventually. But merely waiting at the starting line, comparing frameworks to undescribed alternatives, we barely even have the vocabulary to describe some of these conversational patterns. And now we have more flexibility to like pop out and pull back to the meta science. But again, it's like, okay, so are you saying we can't use math to do in the context of neuroscience? And some people may hold that perspective, and that may be the conversation to have at that time. But once the or somebody may think that the engineering tools, like Bert brought this up many times in the symposium, that machine learning benefits greatly from decades of development on toolboxes. And in his section, he was like, yeah, this is like the optimistic, positive message is within months to years. And Karl also alluded to it in the roundtable, like, we will have closer to push button solutions. So I think that really contextualizes a lot of what we're doing and learning, when a lot of these formalities are going to get just like simply baked in, and people will be engaging at more applied layers. But all in the context of chapter 5, where a variety of empirical data are being brought into play. We're talking about real anatomy, talking about real reflexes, neurotransmitters, real design patterns in the nervous system in the body. So, does anyone want to give a thought or ask any chapter 5 related question? All right, let's just see if we can upvote and just see what comes through. Okay. Schematic in figure 5.1 shows layer 5 of the cortex projects to spinal pyramidal neurons. This can be interpreted as a prediction. Spinal motor neuron and spinal pyramidal neurons are sometimes used interchangeably. SP. Okay. Anyone have a preference for which one of these questions to jump into?
I would be curious about the question regarding how do habits and goals interact. I found this chapter interesting in part just because the introduction of habits, or like the E variable, I suppose.
Yeah, well, let's start with what is a goal. We're going to have to reach outside of the active inference ontology to bring it in, because we don't need goals. Although, at the same time, the term is used prolifically. Let's see how it's used in 5. This is a mixed dialect. E and G are habitual and goal-directed drives. That's a very interesting sense of goal. Like in the football, soccer setting, the goal is like a fixed external objective, like a milestone, but a culminating milestone. But how is it being used here if by goal we mean something that G sharpens? Well, in that case, well, first let's look at what E does. E is the prior on policies. So it reflects before the observation comes in, before updating has happened, what are the prior probabilities of certain actions being taken. And then that observation may not influence E. So E kind of gets passed through. And we see that in the basal ganglia, second example in the chapter, or it gets sharpened. So if we see expected free energy minimization as being goal-directed. Certainly, it's not sufficient to say that goals are pragmatic only. Because if we take everything that G encompasses, like that better policies as evaluated by G are more goal-directed and inferior policies are less goal-directed, then up in the category of more goal-aligned, like let's just say the two most goal-directed policies, they may radically differ in their composition because one may be heavily loaded on pragmatic value, homeostasis, bringing observations into alignment with preferences and all that, and the other policy might have a good expected free energy because of its high epistemic value. And so it seems like, at least just locally here, though probably elsewhere in the book they're talking about goals in just this kind of broader cybernetic goal-oriented sense, here we see the goal is like the process, and the goal is this imperative. Or maybe there's other ways to read it too, but it's kind of like G is, it's like if you were trying to drive somewhere, there's like a location, you're trying to get there with a location and a time. You could also think about that as precision in space and time. Which decisions are going to be more goal-oriented? Well, if the goal is just the location on the soccer pitch, then the most goal-oriented policy is the one that's like locally or globally taking you closest to the location on the soccer field. So that's a situation where like you're like, yeah, there's time, but really, like, let's just pursue the space or location as fast as possible, and we'll get there when we get there. But then if you say, well, we're going to hold up both of these features in this driving example, the space and the time, but in G, the epistemic and pragmatic, and we're going to say, well, actually the joint optimization of those two is what we're going to call our goal. That's a little different sense of goal. But it is used here, and it's specifically used to talk about how habits and goals differ, namely where habits are reflecting the prior probability on taking different actions, kind of the pass-through model, where observations don't influence what actions are likely to be taken, though still actions may be taken at unequal frequencies, whereas goal orientation means an increasing role for expected free energy in sharpening that policy prior into policy posterior. Ollie?
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah, another relevant remark here is about this. You see, there's this kind of teleophobia among biologists, and they usually try to avoid using the word purpose instead of goal, because they believe that although biological agency implies a kind of a goal-directed autonomy, it doesn't necessarily require for those agents to be to have any kind of purposiveness, as Dennett would argue. But the problem here, I mean, the distinguishing between these two concepts is a kind of, I mean, as I said, it probably emerges from this teleophobia among biologists, because any talk of purposiveness can be seen as provoking teleology, which is something that scientific culture has been very averse from many centuries ago. But if we somehow define goals or purposes as a kind of mechanistic lawfulness to apparently purposive behavior, then this dilemma between these two concepts would probably be resolved, because in this case, we have basically defined a goal in terms of purposiveness. So they're not actually separate terms, and they co-constitute each other. Of course, the same kind of phobia was evident, probably much more. It was a bit more prominent a couple of decades ago, but it was also evident in the for the concept of function. But it seems like this phobia has been diminished in recent years. But nevertheless, this teleophobic refusal to accept purposes as real factors in biology still remains. But active inference and some of these recent progresses in biology, as I said, works of Michael Levin and others, are ways to somehow dismantle this dichotomy and this teleophobia, and as David Krakauer would call, to see complex systems as a kind of teleonomic matter. So it doesn't necessarily something that would require us to think about any, I don't know, supernatural entities or transcendental entities to get into the picture. We can talk about purely naturalistic and mechanistic teleology as well, using these goals and purposes in this kind of interrelated terms.
Yeah, great comments. One more piece on that from like the so-called argument by design, which has actually played a very interesting role, arising most famously in the watchmaker analogy, which is like you're walking on it, putting aside the big meta, which is like, what is the utility of any thought experiment or any like little narrative walkway that somebody provides you? It just is like, if you look at a watch, you're going to infer intention of a creator. And so then the argument sometimes plays out like, well, look at all the small bones in the ear, or look at the way that the retina is. Then the design argument became actually one of the design and engineering became some of the key pieces of the modern evolutionary synthesis in evolutionary biology. But as Ali alludes to, there always was this kind of teleophobia, as Mike Levin calls it sometimes, or just like this awkwardness around like, well, are we going to appeal to just all functions just as they are? So that's like a sort of like functional teleology, just or does one go the kind of Teilhard de Chardin, Omega Point, Bobby Azarian angle? Like that is the account. And where the radical biology in a way speaks to that or cuts the knot is like the hidden fallacy in the watchmaker fuss is like it tries to transfer the analogy of a top-down function bestowment. Whereas if we have self-creating or co-creating or embedded arisal, then we can say, yeah, like the circadian circuit arose through evolution and development as a bottom-up, self-created in relation mechanism for just that, telling time. So at the level of linguistic coarse graining, it makes sense to say that the circadian clock keeps time, just speaking super broadly here, like a watch keeps time. But there's a critical difference, which is that the watch was like an engineering artifact as a top-down projection of a cognitive system, whereas some kind of like internal organic representational system like a circadian clock is actually like a bottom-up construction. So like there just isn't an issue with describing or understanding goals, and it's just an English word anyway. Once we really start to get into the specifics with agency and habit, a lot of this may just dissipate. And in the more recent multi-scale formalizations, the habits can include like the phylogenetic scale, or the habit could refer to just what is passed through moment to moment in the organism's life, or you could imagine this as being like a intergenerational transfer, and a habit or a developmental tendency for a habit is also able to be inherited. Andrew, any thoughts on that, or wherever anyone else wants to go?
No, I don't have any deeper thoughts on that, I suppose. I guess I'm more interested in the sort of computational aspect of it as far as message passing goes, rather than I mean, I find all of the kind of the more abstract philosophical side of discussing what goals are very interesting, and in certain ways very important when putting together a framework. But I guess here it's just I just found it interesting, like, oh, now we have habits in addition to G, which I previously considered to be like just expected free energy. But maybe I have my terminology mixed up here. Is this G not the same as
Oh, you're totally right, and I think that's just, it's a little coincidental alliteration. And G never stands for goals. It's just a total typographical spandrel. So then the question becomes, what is the goal concept broad enough to encompass what it is that G does? And that's clearly not the same thing as just like the mile marker on the side of the road. But then a little bit more on the computational side, E primes the pump for the procedure that G does. Like the shape of the variable E is the same shape that gets taken into G. The cells in the variable E are what get sharpened by G as it iterates through every policy and calculates its expected free energy. So E and G, they both are engaging with this policy variable, which is just a list of all the possible policies. So all the affordances basically raised to the power of how many time steps that you want to play it out for. And G sharpens what E provides, or modifies what E provides. And the gamma, the temperature parameter on decision making, here associated with dopamine neuromodulation, is modulating that trade-off between the E pass forward in the indirect pathway. So it's kind of type 1, and then the policy updating driven by G.
Sure. No, thanks for kind of giving more explanation on that. It's so I find that very interesting then, because at some point in here it refers to like sorry, I can't find it immediately, but the use of the word context. So it's as if so those are your priors over policies, and so you're lacking something like context of the agent is lacking context in a given moment, I suppose, such that one might like rely upon their habits to deal with the scenario, whereas G is in fact taking into account not only E, but context in the sense of, the agent is taking in observations, it's computing expected free energy. I guess I'm just putting everything together as far as I understand it. So it's E prime, you start with E, you enter into some context with a variety of observations or otherwise. From there, you begin to compute G, and then from there, you can start to actually score potential policies to be taken, with some of them deemed to be more minimizing of free energy given the context and so on, versus E, which seems to be more or less static through the whole computation. Does all of that track?
Yeah, great points. So definitely, when you set it up, you could make it so that E is fixed, or that you can make it so that E counts like earns. That's one simple learning technique. But it's a great connection with context. So like, let's just say that we are playing cards, and then it's like, the main idea is we have beliefs about how we act in particular contexts. You know, we're playing 21 blackjack, and I stay 80% of the time, just habitually. So the two cards are dealt face down. Habit is before the context is recognized, or paying no attention to context. You take the 80% stay. And then context, we could translate as basically like the sensory observations and the ensuing sense making. So now you look at the cards, and then you're going to sharpen through G. Now, again, that doesn't even mean it's better than playing on reflex. It doesn't mean it's better than playing 50-50. It doesn't mean you're going to win. It doesn't mean like all these like kind of outcome oriented possibilities in the world. But it is the case, like, if one lets the card that they saw influence their decision making, we would model that as the generative model using expected free energy based policy evaluation planning as inference, even if it's just one time step planning. That's how we understand the situation where a person who stays 80% of the time looks at the cards and makes a decision that differs from that. Or it could be who else is at the table. And then, so then they want to make a certain move, not because it aligns their pragmatic value with winning the pot, but that it gains them information about who they're playing with and their strategies, which speaks to this kind of thinking through other minds topic, and also just the need to build specific generative models. Because how could we talk about what is an expected free energy minimizing decision in the context of a blackjack game unless you've delineated like what is even being considered? But now think about how far people go beyond the blackjack game, talking about what does and doesn't reduce expected free energy.
No, thanks again for that. That was very clarifying. And yeah, so suddenly the phrase is model free versus model based systems in this context makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, model free, just kind of flailing, but that may be an effective flail, and it may be an effective way to go. Or model based is where you get more explicit structuring. Okay, this one's a freebie. Popcorn in the chat, or however. What other neural systems are interesting to model other than the 3 that are in chapter 5? What's another mammalian neural region or a non-mammalian system that would be fun to model?
Actually, I would very love to see active inference applied for modeling emotion circuitry. And in fact, it's an ongoing project of mine, but it proves much more complicated than I previously imagined. But as well, some preliminary works have been done by people like Ryan Smith and others, but there still needs, I mean, lots of work for this kind of modeling to be as mature and sophisticated as some other areas that active inference has been applied to. But for me personally, it's a really interesting prospect to see how modeling emotion circuitry and even modeling emotion itself using active inference terminology and concepts would reveal some deep mysteries about emotion and its relation to cognition and other mental faculties. So yeah, that's one area of interest.
Cool. A few things that Dr. Anna Lemke said today in the roundtable that stuck with me. One was like about this co-presentation. I won't even call it a tension or a paradox between accepting higher power and taking agency in one's own life, which she related to her like context in the psychiatry and addiction setting. And then also it came up later, like with precision and monitoring and the increasing ability for monitoring of our biometrics, and like just the bigger picture on how like maybe knowing your heart rate at all times, maybe it spirals off in all these different ways. Like now you have too much precision on heart rate, you're paying too much attention to it, or there was just a lot of interesting pieces there. And then also there was a discussion about like limitations of the brain as a predictive system, or of modeling the brain as a predictive system. And yet again, another place where action comes in to like save the day / slam dunk, because it's like, well, yeah, when it's a prediction about what you're about to do, it's only a prediction for so long, and then it happens. So it's like a lot of these like prediction, like they're often implicitly in this kind of like archaic dark room setting, like where actions can't be taken and it's just a perceptual question. But we know that perception plays action plays a role in perception itself through the eye saccade and through the example at the beginning of the textbook where like you can't determine the texture of a fabric without moving your finger. So it's like, well, it's not demeaning to say that it's predictive when it gets implemented a split second later. But so much of the predictive discussion focuses just on like you know, predictive analytics, predictive forecasting, what's going to be the most popular song next year. And that's a very removed way of considering the role of action and inference. But yeah, a lot of neural systems to model. Okay, just kind of a related question. What point does, oh, Ollie, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make maybe a sideway remarks, but there's even this recent trend toward the probabilistic aesthetic theory of art. So, and especially as applied to avant-garde or contemporary art. So, and they call it predictive arts. One pioneer in this area is Konrad Wojnowski, which is who also has an upcoming book. I think it will be published in February 2024. But yeah, as you said, these kinds of probabilistic modes of sensing and making sense of reality has started to being applied to even aesthetics and contemporary art criticism as well.
Cool. Yeah, I remember this paper. This was I was in the buy it based on the title phase of my graduate school access to free printing. And I just remember thinking this was like the funniest and boldest title, because it's like several sentences and it has all these weird illusions in it. But this and I think ActInf goes beyond it. But on the left side here is the timescales, like from like the 100 millisecond, visual region, this and that, and the shorter term memory, and okay, we're at an exhibit, so there's the context window of like what we've seen from the exhibition, and then it even expands out to like, let's see how slow it gets in the very slowest, very, very slow, like lifelong mastery, I think, or something. Transformation 60 plus seconds, but then the transformative capacity and Bert talked about it in the symposium with like the need for longer term, lower resolution estimates, and how a key engineering question right now is being able to adjust basically the computational resources allocated to different kinds of estimates. So I gave an example of like, if you're going to drive 3/4 of the way around a roundabout, you don't need to know like what centimeter it's going to be at. You just want to know what lane you're going to be in, but the next centimeter might matter for the next centimeter. And so being able to like dynamically tune or develop hierarchical structures or other kinds of inference architectures where we're getting a lot of like bang for the buck, because we're using our CPU cycles and other resources, but ultimately attention and trust on, like, we're not calculating 12 decimal points for something that could have just been left at 1, and vice versa. Where does reasoning sit in 5.5? I think it depends what you define reasoning as. But it looks like in some previous discussions, we've talked about like reasoning as unconscious inference. And just depends on what is meant by reasoning. Is it any kind of reckoning, or is it specifically like a consciously aware one? But that's a good question. Is FEP applicable to any system? Let's vote.
The perennial question.
Okay, I'm going to flip a coin. This is going to be a real coin flip. I'm going to use the real entropy of my room. It was not a coin with heads or tails, so it was not a conclusive answer. But I hope that in future discussions we can figure out more. Generalist tools to interact with Bayesian mechanics. I think I remember this question being asked and who asked it. And the mechanisms in the brain. At the on this topic, actually, the first presentation in the symposium by Andre Bastos. This was very much like welcome to the neuroscience conference. Like not grandstanding at all with a theoretical connection, just like, this is how it's being visually processed. Here's how we're doing more and more measurements. Here's how theory is guiding our experiments. And it did come up to this like multi-band alpha beta and then the gamma, like the differential, which we talked about, I think, in 1 or 2 times ago, differential frequencies. Well, cohort 3.
Sorry, Daniel, there was this question, I think the one down, the last one you
Okay.
talked about is there any alternative representation for something like that? Yeah, are there alternative visualizations that better? So I think we have an additional answer to this question now because of Chantal's work in string diagrams. So,
great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe Yana made this image, and then I know that Berkers has done a ton of work in like alternative visual and tactile metaphors. And then on the more formal side, you're absolutely right that the string diagram may even, or some of the representations that Sanjeev is developing in the fundamentals work. Certainly we're seeing things that are like familiar, but also different. So great works, cohort 4. That's our final recorded discussion. Next week we'll have feedback and talk a little bit. Then we'll take a few weeks off and get the gang back together for cohort 4 part 2 and for cohort 5. And we'll talk more next week about the timing for everything and see what works for people. So thank you all. Till next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.